Something that you guys had mentioned in that first meeting was just the stigma around mental health. And, when just to kind of start diving into that word stigma, when you hear that, what meaning do you make around stigma? How would you, not necessarily how you would define it, but what does it feel like when it comes up? If you have a definition for it, if we think, what do we think about it? What do we feel about it? And what's our response to it in our head, our heart, and our gut? What is it around this thing of stigma?
When I think stigma, I always think negative adjectives.
Yeah.
It's generally always bad. So I almost kind of sense prejudices. So mental health is never in a good sense. So it's that must mean I'm crazy, or there's something wrong with me.
It's always negative, and I like that phrase you said, there's something wrong with me. When I was, I looked it up this morning just because I actually don't even know the technical definition of stigma. So what pops up, I can't even reference what I looked this up on, actually, the internet. But it said that there's actually a mark of disgrace was what it used in those words. And I like that you used there's something wrong with me, because that's a shame piece. That, I think that previously in years before, I've always thought, oh, it's a negative stereotype. But really, it's actually deeper than that. It's more of a disgrace piece. It's more of a shame piece. Anything else that you guys are thinking of? I think you honestly hit it on the nail on the head.
I fear when I think stigma. It's it's something you're fearful of being known as something, or I don't know. I just fear is what hits me when I think stigma.
Stigma to me it's kind of synonymous with a myth, something that's not just not true. Just so I feel like I've been lied to. Or that I believe something that's obviously not true.
Yeah. It kind of gets into almost I like that myth, and even we have that kind of coming forward, but there's almost these urban legends in some way around the meaning we make, specifically even around mental health and stigma. And the history around people and mental health, while it started well, almost like asylums for people who were experiencing difficulty in their life because of probably as they started to figure out mental health imbalances, there was these really kind of retreat places, but they very quickly became almost like prisons in some ways, and experimental places that we're going to do experiments on these extreme people who are violent and dangerous, or we can't understand them in some way. I think too, historically, it's been a lot of spiritualized in some ways. And I'm very much, just full disclosure, I think that we are both material and spiritual beings, and God is at work in the world. So I think we shouldn't totally discredit that sometimes what comes up even as depression and anxiety is not maybe God doing a work, and it is a spiritual thing. I think it's also a material, bodily thing in a lot of ways. But there is kind of these stories that we operate off of, whether we can nail them down or not, these myths in some way. Yeah. Anything else, guys? Well, I guess we can move back from the title slide. I pulled, I honestly just pulled two different lists of myths, actually, from Good Therapy, and then there's another one, Psych Central. And just starting on this Good Therapy one, which ones land or resonate with you?
Yeah, I was going to say one for sure.
Yeah, that's kind of the big one, the weakness one.
I think three, extreme issues, but not just for an average person growing.
Yeah. That it's more brokenness related instead of growth and health related. Yeah. I think the therapy will make me worse is a big people's fear. And that one too, I think there's something actually true to that myth, because even if we think back on how emotions are embodied, and if something is too difficult and overwhelms us, what do? We repress it, we push it down, we kind of get rid of it, whether through denial or just all these different things, we self-medicate. So to actually turn, and I think that this has very therapy language on it, but I think we can kind of generalize it to getting the help and support you need, whether that's therapy or not. But sometimes to actually turn and take a look at these things inside of us ends up really making it worse because we're doing what our body has done to protect us. We're doing the opposite. So a lot of times I think it is really true that people will feel worse because they're finally looking at these points of pain in their life in a lot of ways. So that one is a myth and is kind of true in some ways, but often it's like if you can see, what's that saying, you have to go through to get through, that if you go down that often it will eventually get better in some way. Anything else from this list? There's a second list too. That's more, I think, in like the vernacular. It's I really like the second one. I think just really puts it simply in so many ways. What about number 6? Therapy or mental health support is too expensive.
Absolutely.
That's a big one. Finally, really in the last 5 or 10 years, insurance companies have only really just started to pay for people's mental health care, which has made it far more accessible. But historically, even like psychoanalysis that came down through Freud, which really was he's like kind of the father of psychology in some ways, and then went out into all these different modalities. But it was really for wealthy, kind of the worried well individuals in a lot of ways. And I think sometimes that myth, that legend still exists in some ways, that therapy is only for people who are resourced in some ways. And I think that there's still a lot of work to do around making it accessible to people, but really that there are places and models designed at every socioeconomic status along the way to start, and maybe therapy looks a little different or mental health support looks a little different at each step along the way, but there really is, I think if people search hard and long enough, there really is supports that people can access in that way. What else? Anything else popping out to you guys?
7, here it is. Is this the second page?
Second, yep.
Can only 7.
Mm-hmm.
Therapists can only help if they experience the same thing.
Mm-hmm. I have a big note by this one. Tell me, do you have any background thoughts at all on that, Eric, or is it just you noticed it and there's something about it that sticks out to you?
Oh no, I definitely have. Yeah, just in the church, a lot of personal experiences, just dealing with different cases. People in the church.
The church is and I actually really value this as well, but the church is a huge wisdom and respect culture. And how do you get wisdom? You grow up and you experience things. Even think of, let's say, like premarital or couples therapy. In some ways, there's a truth to that only after you go through marriage can then you maybe turn and look back and help somebody along. There's a huge value on older people, experience. I'm trying to think of other things, but really those two are kind of what pops out in my mind. Sometimes, depending on what denomination or theological place you land in, sometimes gender falls in there too, around who is actually capable and able to turn and provide the experience that's needed. But I think that this is and is not true. And when you said it, I can't tell if you're saying it in like I've experienced it maybe in the negative or some ways, but I even think of all the kiddos and families that we deal with that deal with trauma. Thank the Lord that I don't have to personally experience every trauma in the world to be useful and helpful and supportive to somebody. I'm not married, and I have done like years of couples therapy with somebody, and I would say that there is a knowledge I don't know. There is also this other like knowledge and skill set that's like, oh, I can be helpful to you guys in some way. This like turning towards and communicating from your heart, in some way. So this is in the Christian culture, I think specifically, there is a value here that I think undercuts people's gifting in some way or what they have to offer. There are like 4 big resiliency factors, and a sense of support is one of them. So having people in your life, there is something true about this, that it's like, yes, all these different things. And I think that sometimes we need to take a step back and think of levels of care. Is how do you have your baseline, basic need level of care? I have people in social support in my life, And then really it's usually when something goes wrong, let's say in a Christian context, we go to a pastor, or even like within maybe the mentors that you guys work with, and like that then provide the direct need to the kids and their families, is that they come to you then as almost like a higher level of care to start to work and deal with these things. And I think that depending on the intensity and the duration of what people are experiencing, sometimes you have to bump up to a higher level of care that will wrap tight. Even me as a counselor sees people on a weekly basis, I'm not the highest level of care. Really, a hospital would be the highest level of care, that where they'd go and they'd live and they'd stay, which sometimes is like needed in that way. But I think if we can take a step back and realize there's something really good about that social support, and honestly, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for the church to take back its care for its people in a really holistic way. If I get anywhere in the course of my career, I think that's really what I'm going for, what I'm hoping for, because the church has really outsourced a lot of its care for people. And thankfully, I think that there's lots of great providers here in Chicago. I would hope our team would be considered among one of them. But how do we continue to equip the church to actually do this care, but to do it in a healthy way and also utilize higher levels of support? Yeah.
What are those other resiliency factors?
Yeah. Sense of humor is one of them, that you can laugh at yourself and your circumstances. You can kind of like mentally take a step back and be like, oh my gosh, like this is funny, or this is like, I can't believe all these things are lining up. Social support, sense of efficacy, which translates to a strong sense of self, and then being able to make meaning, that I feel connected to something larger than myself. So meaning making and purpose. Exactly. Kind of, I think belonging, I think, threads through so many of those, like you mentioned, though.
Efficacy.
A strong sense of self or efficacy, meaning making and purpose.
Efficacy meaning you can process things and advocate.
I think meaning by that's a great question. I think that a strong sense of efficacy, a strong sense of self, comes from some of that self-awareness piece. I can understand the narrative and what has shaped me, and I have values, and I kind of, not to put too like psychobabble, but I trust myself in some ways. I trust that I can show up in a situation in the best way I possibly can. Some of that like groundedness. So really social support and sense of self get at internally I feel grounded, and I feel grounded in my people, collectively. The sense of humor, I always kind of lean into that one. That's my favorite. It's actually considered a high-level coping mechanism that, and kind of like I think some of the language is like it's more of an intellectual coping mechanism in some ways, that like people who are more able to like connect all the pieces use. But I just think in general, you can say and experience so much more. What is it? Oh my gosh, laugh or cry. Yeah. There's something about laughing that helps us get through a moment, because we're like, oh my gosh, this is kind of ridiculous. Yeah. Right. So, really what we're doing already as we kind of move through these is we're actually, I never bumped it over for you guys. We're actually reframing all these different myths and stigma, this sense of shame, as actually a sense of strength, that there is something strong about someone who turns to support in a time of need. And I think that really, like, I just put a few up here. I'm curious, if you guys have any more, if you see that question just as we're talking. But if there is this experience of I am weak, that you and myself like operate out of this messaging of there's something weak about me, that I can't just white knuckle my way through this and get through my problems, especially, considering we live in kind of the American dream, pull myself up by my bootstraps. And if I can't do this, there's something weak and defective about me. But that actually, kind of even that we touched on earlier, to reframe that as a sense of like, there's actually something super brave in like looking at the stuff you've been avoiding, and that is actually very strong, that you would kind of willingly enter into that, because it's a scary place. There's so much unknown on the other side of leaning into fear and sadness and shame and all these different things. So if we can help people move from a sense of I am weak to actually, you know what, the fact that you're even thinking about doing that, it just blows me away. I think that that's really brave, and to shift people from those different things. expensive, even like for someone, let's say like, I used to work in a community mental health clinic where sometimes people did pay like $0, but sometimes people paid $5, and that was a stretch for what they could afford. So thinking like people who pay $5, even to people who pay, $150, $175 per session, there's a whole gamut here, but that it's actually that, yes, this maybe is spending money and it's not, but it's actually an investment in yourself and in your future, in your relationships, in your health, in some ways, that if we can shift some of that. I think that the shame, when I put this up here, I was thinking more of that sense of self. I don't trust myself. There's something wrong with me. It kind of goes, I think, with the weakness one in some ways, but that a person could move from I don't trust myself to having almost like more of a strong internal voice. And I think a more clear ability to listen to God's voice too. Sometimes I think just getting all of the other noise-making things out of our life, and even sometimes voices we carry with us, leaves us with being everybody else but us. So that you can move from a sense of like, I'm not enough, to actually, no, I really do trust myself in some way. Stuck in never changing, I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory. I've been there. I would imagine that a lot of you guys have been there. That turning to the support you need is actually a catalyst for growth. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, even for myself, let's say it's not even with my therapist, let's say it is with a good friend, I get I'll give you an example. My mom is getting remarried in a few weeks. We're all really happy for her. It has been a little bit difficult to coordinate plans at the same time. And I think that I'm one of 4 girls, and all my sisters and I had a sense of how we wanted to spend our time home in Quincy this weekend. And it's kind of come up as a point of tension in some ways. And I was actually just right around the corner at Julia and Steph's house. I was telling you about them last week. And I'm kind of telling them about like, oh yeah, it's not really going so well. And Steph, in her very blunt and direct way, she goes, well, it's not like it's your mom's wedding weekend or anything, Alex, is it? That there's something about like, how can other people propel us and get us out of our own mental space and give us some perspective and clarity that actually gets us unstuck in some ways. So for me, just to kind of like cool it with my mom's wedding. But that bringing other people in is often a way to increase momentum. And again, we already kind of talked about this, but I'm going to get worse. That this is actually, if I look at it, I'm going to feel more depressed. If I talk about loneliness, that actually is, I'm going to feel that more, and that's going to be really painful. And that really looking at what's bad in our lives helps us accept it. It helps us actually make change out of it, because if you understand it, you can take action on it. And that maybe if you do go towards the worst, that actually it's in the path towards getting better in some ways. So how does that land with you guys, that this whole like reframing things? Because it's the same content, and I don't want to put false positivity on it. I think there's a way to like encourage people that actually speaks deeply into them. But even that question, what do you get hung up on with this? And what are you thinking out there?
When it's not like a practical need, like it's not like housing or in some ways those feel like easier fixes than like anger and like depression and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I think the students were more open, I guess, in that regard.
Sometimes too, I think framing it as a relationship, like you're gonna go and get to know somebody, and you'll get to know them, and they'll get to know you. But like even kind of like using your own relationship, think of how long it took for me to get to know you. These things about you, you have to give it a little bit of time. And sometimes even to, for people who are not your students who call our intake line, to just kind of be like, hey, let's like think about this as like, can you put 2 months investment into this? Obviously, if your gut says that this is not the right person to be meeting with, we want to know that, but really research shows that in about 8 to 12 sessions, there should be some type of change in your life. There should be some type of symptom reduction, or you understand something differently. And really, if you come every single week, that's about 2 months. So can you even just put a month, 4 times in a row, that would allow me to get to know you and you get to know me, so we can even see if this would be something. Sometimes it's like, don't put the years. That what is it? Therapy is endless. Where is that one?
Yeah. It's never gonna stop.
Yeah.
You know, before.
Yep. I don't know where it is. It's on this one, I
I
think.
think too, a lot
Yeah.
of the students that I've worked have had a really hard time going to a white counselor, and it's really hard to find a black counselor.
Yeah.
Really
You know, I always have to be careful on the HR when we're we're hiring clinicians all the time, and it is, you know, first of all around diversity, but I think diversity is so much more. First of all, we bring all of our experiences, but then also like, culture, race, age, even, you know, there's people that come from different Christian backgrounds, you know, that they can understand somebody in a different way. So really, like at Optimum Joy, we really like strive to have a pretty diverse, and really everybody is different from each other, you know, so that's pretty easy to, if you want to like really generalize it, wrap our mind around. But there is something about, there's maybe a pain point around race and ethnicity that it's like, I really long for and need someone who looks like me and really understands at a visceral level what I'm going through. You know, it's kind of like, again, some of that is true, some of it's not true, the experience piece. I feel like, Brooke, what you started to get into is how does culture, you know, and in my notes, I was kind of walking through this morning, I add like generational, because I think that mental health stigma has come, even in the last few years, it's actually really popular to have a therapist right now. I was talking to somebody, he runs kind of the young professionals area of a really large church in the city, and he was saying that like, I cannot tell you in like when we get together how many times I hear the statement, my therapist says. It's like everybody has a therapist, everybody's swapping what their therapist says. It's kind of like a really cool thing, but I think that shows that it's actually, there's been a huge shift that people are valuing, whether it's therapy or not, this idea of how do I be mentally well? And I think that that's a huge shift from like generations before. But how does some of this culture, and even like specific examples, I think that mental health in the African American community is statistically, they access resources less. And what's going on there that's the case specifically? I think sometimes in, you know, I didn't really pull up any specific numbers and resources for this, but that a lot of times, I'm trying to think of if I remember the numbers. There's some numbers in like the Hispanic community that they start and see, like maybe stick with it 3 times, and then they stop. You know, so what are these trends that we see that actually is maybe coming from culture? That culture is feeding into this in our specific way.
And, I mean, I think off the top of my head, there's a lot of things I think about. At least like speaking for someone that's African American, thinking like, even growing up, you see, like, you watch movies. So a lot of things about culture, like movies, right? What you think.
Right.
How often counseling is for like rich white people.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of the picture. And then also, I feel like my experience is like, man, I go through so much. Like there's a lot of things that I feel like systemic injustice that you face on a daily basis, and so you learn to cope and be able to handle a lot more. So it's just another thing. And then and then I think also there is a part of just like privacy, where you just don't like talk about these things and like let other people into like what's going on in the home or whatever it may be, which can be detrimental. So
vulnerability in general is a risk, and you think of like that picture of like when I was saying like it's almost like a dog doesn't just roll over on his tummy and let anybody pet it because that's like vital organs it's exposing. But I think that vulnerability in some ways is that, unless they trust somebody, but vulnerability is that kind of rolling over and showing your softer side that makes you really vulnerable to harm. And how is just like coming to somebody on an emotional level a risk to your like personhood, but then also add to it that maybe there is something that you don't know if my kids are going to get taken away. That if I really tell somebody what really goes on in our home, they may take away my family, and my family is everything to me. It's actually the only thing that's keeping me holding on.
for sure,
Yeah.
for sure.
It's a huge risk. Yeah. You know, I think too, even just like generally speaking in the Christian community, I was speaking to a young man, he's a friend of mine, and he was thinking about going to counseling. He went once, and he kind of said, what was his language? He said, I it was like nice, but I'm just gonna like pray more about it, which I think is so good. Like, don't hear me saying we shouldn't pray about the things we're suffering through. But this idea of hyper spiritualizing some of our day in and day out struggles in a way that's actually not helpful, because, and this is just my opinion, and obviously you don't know him, but my opinion of it is like, oh no, there's a lot of like goodness that if you work through some of these self-deprecating pieces, that maybe God has a lot of goodness for you on the other end, but to not be able to access like the perspective of somebody else to help him get there, because it should just be God in me. Well, I actually think it's God and his people.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Let's keep going. I think that this is actually, it's not my last slide. These are my last 2 slides, and then we'll just kind of like reflect together. I always try to leave with like, okay, practically, what do we do about this? We spent a lot of time talking about how do you just like reframe it for people, reframe it positively, which is kind of mostly what we spent our time on today. I think just to start, if you were to think like, how do I actually start to come against the stigma on a way is like, you're not going to be lobbying in court for laws. You're probably not like, you're not going to maybe be working on that systemic way, but like to start in your area of influence, I think to use emotional language. How different does it sound for someone to say, oh yeah, I'm really busy. Oh yeah, I'm feeling lonely. Way different. And I think it's, people don't talk like that because it's kind of weird. Because people don't talk that way. But to start actually owning some of this feelings language in our day-to-day language starts to actually, first of all, tell yourself that it's okay. Because if you're going to come against stigma, you got to actually believe this to be true for yourself. But then it allows and gives space for somebody else to be like, oh, he just said he's lonely. Maybe it's okay for me to say something like that in this space. So I think that we have to start using more emotional language in some way in our day-to-day lives, obviously in a way that's appropriate. I think that this looks different in different contexts. I put reference therapists up here. I personally do it all the time. Hopefully, I don't think people have the opinion that I'm crazy. So I think that some people can add to the stigma and some people can come against it in some ways. But it's just kind of like to actually say, yeah, actually I was talking to my therapist about this the other day. Not necessarily in the way this church is it, where everybody's kind of like, it's like a cool factor in some way, but really just kind of like, yeah, I was, who am, I would say, like a pretty normal person who's pretty emotionally stable, was talking about this, and I go see him every single week, and I cannot tell you the times I've been talking to someone that they're like, oh my gosh, you see a therapist? And you can see it kind of strip away a layer of, well, you're not like broken in some ways. I would argue the difference, but I think just listening for opportunity that like, okay, you guys all belong to a very specific and unique culture. In your families, that's a cultural context. In your churches, that's a cultural context. In Grip Youth Outreach, like that's a cultural context. In Chicago, cultural context. In your like racial or ethnic background, that's a cultural context. How do I start listening with an ear to my areas of influence so I can actually start to, first of all, accept it in my own self, but come against it? I would say be kind in this regard. People believe stigmas because it is a shame piece. It is actually a softer thing inside, that something is broken in me, that I feel like I can't actually reach out for this. So just like to really be gracious and kind and not be harsh when you do start to come against these things. Always look for ways to encourage people to get support. I think that sometimes, let's say you can't do this with every student, but you specifically put mentors in place. Oh my gosh, have you talked to your mentor about this? I think you should really do that. I think that maybe, they could be even just like a listening ear. Maybe you just define it as like baseline, but that they would maybe support you in that way. Have you talked to your mom about this if you know it's like a safe relationship? Have you, just to encourage people in the level of support that they need. I think it can also be counseling and therapy. If the intensity and the duration starts to get to where their daily life functioning is off. They're not doing daily life well. So then we maybe refer to a higher level of care. But always be encouraging people to get support. And then I think too, for those of you who are up in front of people and who are leaders, to start to put some of this, like whether it's through stories or just like general themes, you know, even like I think depression and anxiety is very accessible and understandable to the wide majority of the population. How do we start to maybe use some of this language or tell stories or all these different things that as the person people look to sends a message that this is actually okay in some ways. You know, some of the favorite work I've ever done is I was an adult leader in a college ministry out in Wheaton. And it was in collaboration where all three of us would be in the same room with a pastor, a student, and myself. And to actually come at it that it's like, no, this actually is very much a spiritual thing. It is also very much something that we can look at practically and experientially from like a human experience. And that was some of my favorite work. And I think that if we can get to that in some capacity within that, it's like, because I do think pastors and leaders have something to offer, a type of care, and also other things have a type of care. So how can we start to combine or wrap tight in multiple ways around somebody and give them kind of that support in some way? Yeah. I just put this up here. I say this all the time. I think about it all the time. I really don't think, kind of like Carly said, like there's something about my experience that has developed grit and determination and a hardiness within me that I can handle life. And I would say that like not everybody actually needs to go to therapy. I think that it can be helpful to everybody in some ways, whether it's like a job transition, whether it's like family of origin and boundary issues, whether it's like I have these overwhelming feelings. You know, there's a lot of different things that people can like seek out help for, but I think that we do also need to be connected in our daily lives with God, with other people, with ourselves. And then also maybe connected to somebody who actually has this background and profession. That's what I had for you guys on stigma. I hope it was helpful.